Ah yes, that one time Hungary decided to remember that it used to have one of the most functional armored vehicle industries in that corner of the world when it bolted a pair of fighter jet engines to a tank for putting out fires. Today we're going to talk about Big Wind, a Hungarian T-34 tank which jumped on a Soviet trend of using jet engines for utility vehicles and is definitely not the name of somebody's farts. This tank looks like it belongs in the ranks of Hobart's funnies storming Normandy, but instead of being made by the British to fight Germans, it was made by the Hungarians to fight Mother Nature. Big Wind has got to be the heaviest and the coolest piece of firefighting equipment ever to grace the surface of the Earth. And the reason it's so heavy is because it was made to take on the toughest fires it could find, although it wouldn't have a whole lot of trouble finding them in the early 90s. Throwback to 1991. The Soviet Union is collapsing, bringing the Cold War to an end. The first public website is going to be released, signaling the rise of the internet. And halfway across the world, Saddam Hussein and his Iraqi forces are getting their cans tanned by NATO coalition forces in Kuwait after they invaded in August of last year. After winning the Iran-Iraq war, his country was broke and owed Kuwait for loans to pay for that war. But instead of paying them back afterwards, he decided to take his massively larger military and just steamroll his way in. Don't have to pay back the banks if you own the banks, I guess.
How did you get the house back from the bank?
I bought the bank.
But now it's late February 1991, and after trying to play Kuwait like a child plays a video game with a hacker console, he is now getting hit with the admin of existence known as the US military and friends. And what do you do if you're a dictator/hacker who's rightfully getting his behind tanned by a superior fighting force? Right, you throw a temper tantrum on the way out and cause as much damage as possible. And in this case, that meant sabotaging and blowing up the oil wells during their retreat and spilling 11 million barrels worth of crude into a 9-mile-long oil slick in the Persian Gulf in one last-ditch attempt to spit in the Western world's face.
I've got this completely under control.
Is that why everything's on fire?
Now, I'm not sure if you understand how big of a deal that was. Blowing up an oil field and lighting the wells on fire is like starting a forest fire but with napalm, and the trees are 300 feet tall and made from literal fountains of flame shooting out of the ground at a fluid pressure of 4,400 pounds per square inch. Because of that pressure and speed, the primary flame, or the core of a fire and its hottest part, wasn't stuck close to the ground like in your average house fire, but instead hovering off the ground by 15 to 30 feet. And because of how much energy is being burned, these fires can reach temperatures over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit or 1,649 degrees Celsius, which is just barely under the melting point of titanium. Trying to put out an oil well fire is like trying to decapitate a fire elemental that can melt the dashboard on your car from 500 feet away standing still. Under most conditions, civilians have to be evacuated from up to a 3-mile radius of an oil well fire, but in Kuwait, there was basically nowhere to run. And that was because the Iraqis destroyed almost 700 oil wells and lit at least 500 of them on fire during their 4-day retreat across the entire country. The plumes of smoke stretched for 800 miles through the atmosphere and tanked the air temperature from 90 degrees in cities as far away as Riyadh to 50 degrees in Kuwait City, effectively creating a nuclear winter over a surface that looked like Dante's Inferno several hundreds of square miles wide. The smoke effectively reversed Kuwait's hemisphere because the smoke turned days into nights and fires turned nights into variably lit days. Plus, because the smoke was hot, the rising hot air would create rainstorms in the upper atmosphere, which would drop black oily rains and cover everything under those clouds in oil and soot. On top of that, the oil cooking into the country's sandy soil created this hard coating they called tarcrete, over about 5% of the entire country's landmass. And the oil rains would become toxic or even lethal inhalants for people and livestock alike.
That's where all the microplastics are going into your body.
But it's also a massive economic worry because these fires were burning 5 million barrels of oil a day. The average American price of gas today in October of 2025 is a few cents over $3 a gallon, and there are 42 gallons in a standard US barrel. That makes almost $1.9 billion in oil going up in flames every single day, with a B, for what was speculated to be 100 years if left untouched. And as just one more layer of you, the icing on this dictatorial hate cake, Hussein had his troops lay landmines around the oil wells they blew up to either kill the humanitarian assistance crews or at the very least slow down the relief measures and increase the cost and complexity of getting the job done. And that's not even counting any unexploded NATO ordnance lying around, the fact that firefighting crews had to wait for the shooting to stop before they could actually go in there and get the job started.
Are you done?
This is a titanic environmental crisis, and practically the entire world jumps in to help. Right from the get-go, several things start happening at once. For one, the Kuwaitis would dig a fire ditch that stretched for several hundred miles to prevent the fire from spreading too far, as well as digging up million-gallon reservoirs for seawater. Where were they getting that seawater in the middle of the desert? Well, they just so happen to have a bunch of oil pipes pushing oil out to the coast for shipping, which were also sabotaged. Ironically enough, at least one of those pipelines had actually been built for the explicit purpose of dumping oil on the beach and lighting it on fire to block an amphibious landing. Again, real pity they couldn't use GPS. These pipelines were repaired and reversed to allow seawater to be piped inland. The Kuwaitis would also take a clay-like earthen substance called gatch, which didn't filter into the sand or absorb the oil, and would lay it down to create roads to each of the oil wells. These roads and sites would be built upon by a bunch of different privately contracted firefighting crews who would wait for the wind to shift and push the heat away from them so they could push in and literally spawn camp the portals to hell for a living. The methods for this spawn camping were as numerous as they were creative. Some people would trick shot the fires into going out, while others would come up with their own mechanized monsters to introduce to the fight. One of the wackiest of which would show up in September of that year when the crumbling Soviet Union let a Hungarian crew join the now 27 teams putting out these fires with something that looked like a turbo laser battery mounted to a tank.
A weapon to surpass Papa John.
Now, most stories would just drop this little history nuke and just leave it at something to the effect of, oh, that's really convenient. The Hungarians had a firefighting tank. What a wacky invention. But no, I know that anything wild that still exists in the 21st century has roots somewhere, usually the Cold War. This entire tank looks like something that a child would draw up in their free time, not something that people would make into an actual vehicle. And it's not like people can just Frankenstein this on the fly either. It had to have come from somewhere. So the biggest question is, who comes up with something like this? What kind of maniac is crazy enough to look at a fire, then look at a fighter jet and go, light bulb? So it should make perfect sense that the starting point for an idea that is both absolutely comical and solely effective via sheer overkill brute force would first show up in the Soviet Union. As the Soviet Union began retiring the MiG-15s, MiG-17s, and Il-28s, they began to stockpile in excess of their VK-1 jet engines. Now, what most countries would do is take the engines, scrap them, and use the materials for something else, or just trash them. However, all of that requires money, and money is something that the Soviets had a historical habit of not giving to any of their people. This resulted in a common design philosophy of if it ain't broke, don't fix it, that would sometimes take the form of repurposing old equipment, like putting tank turrets on boats, or in this case, turning jet engines into utility vehicles. What they would do is they would take the VK-1 jet engines, sometimes still attached to the front half of the plane, and bolt them to things like train cars and trucks, and they would basically turn these everyday vehicles into overkill de-icers and snowblowers across the entire Warsaw Pact. Now, I have no idea how the transition from snowblowers to firefighting happened, but I assume it went something like this. Ivan, what if we put hose on jet engine? For vodka? Niet, comrade, that is for drinking. Hose for cleaning things we don't want to touch, like fire and chemicals. Plus, if we put out fire faster, we have more time for vodka. Is good idea. And thus, the jet engine trucks would be upgraded with water hoses, resulted in them being used to handle oil well fires and even nuclear, biological, and chemical washdowns, which they still use today with their NBC protection troops, or RKHB, as the TMS-65U Teplovoy Machiny Specjalnoi, or special heat engine trucks. But like I said, the entire Warsaw Pact got in on the idea, and Hungary, never having shied away from using other designs for inspiration even as far back as before World War II, began experimenting with the concept as well. Oil companies in particular loved the idea of turning old jet engines into firefighting vehicles, especially after they were used to put out an oil well fire at the 168 Algio site in 1968. And so, after they retired the first few of their MiG-21 BIS jet fighters in the very late 1980s or in 1990, they decided to take the jet firefighter to the next level. These are some big-ass birthday candles they're trying to blow out, so it's time to make the biggest ass birthday boy to do it.
My turn.
And so, the MB Drilling Oil Company in Szolnok, Hungary would start working on the one firefighter to rule them all. The MiG-15 engines were one thing, but the MiG-21 BIS used a Tamansky R-25 turbojet engine rated for 9,000 pounds of thrust without afterburner and 15,650 pounds of thrust with it. Granted, they weren't going to be using the afterburners on a firefighting tank, but it's still 1.5 times as powerful as the nearly 6,000 pounds put out by the VK-1, and they wanted to use 2 of them.
It's a vault. What do we need? A drill. It's a bigger vault. What do we need? 2 drills.
A truck chassis would go flying with that much power bolted onto it, so they'd have to use something heavier. So the engineers were all like, what is heavier than truck but still has good mobility? Tank. Yes, a tank. So they got a Korean War era T-34-85, ripped off the turret, and turned it into the closest thing we have to a Star Wars vehicle. And despite the fact that the firefighter tank weighs in at 92,600 pounds, they still have to cap the engine thrust output in use at a safe maximum of only 70%.
How many horsepower do you think this is?
Each engine is paired with a water hose, and together the whole tank can put out 220 gallons or 830 liters of water a second, which is 13,200 gallons a minute. Just for reference, your average fire truck pumps out only 2,000 gallons of water a minute. If you're not catching my drift here, this tracked fart cannon can hit you with an Olympic swimming pool in under an hour. But why water? If I told you to use water to put out an oil fire at home, you'd look at me like an idiot because that's the wrong thing to do. It just spread the fire to everything else and burn the house down because oil and water don't mix. But in an oil well fire, that's exactly why you use water. First of all, you're already outdoors, so there's no house to burn down. Plus, you need to stop the oil from reaching the primary flame, which, remember, is 15 to 30 feet off the ground. You have to decapitate that fire elemental with something that isn't going to mix. Like water. On top of that, the water also cools the flame and takes away its heat, and the jet exhaust caps out the last side of the fire triangle by smothering the fire with burnt air, which has no oxygen left because you already burned it in a jet engine. You put all that together and you can literally douse a fire in 10 seconds flat. Then, after depleting the fire elemental's respawns, the big wind then camps the loading screen for about 20 more minutes to cool the surrounding air and ground. The air around these wells can reach 650 degrees Fahrenheit and the sand around the well 1,300 degrees. Those temperatures are still a risk even after the fire's been put out, because the oil is still blasting out of the well, and if it hits a hot spot on the ground, it'll instantly reach its flash point and start a flash fire, killing everybody around the well and possibly even restarting the well fire. And here's the scary part. Right? Much like the other firefighting equipment, this tank had to get within 25 feet of that well to a flame that can melt car parts from 500 feet away and is just under the melting point of titanium. And I guarantee you that tank isn't made of titanium. This is about as close as humanity's going to get to standing on the surface of the sun, and anybody fighting an oil fire is going to have to get right up in there and get comfortable on top of it. Even using the wind to get close without melting and maybe rinsing God's vacuum gun with water to keep it from melting, the driver and water gunner still had to wear full suits of protective equipment just to hold the controls. And then they were still given a dead man switch they had to flip every 15 minutes to remind people they were still kicking in there.
I'm not dying, you idiot.
The driver and gunner receive LED arrows and paired sound commands to direct the vehicle, which is the only way they can get any directions at all in the midst of the operation. They can't use a telephone because even if they weren't standing right next to a pair of fighter jet engines, the oil well alone is almost as loud. So the operators are pretty much limited to getting turned into a manned RC car taking orders from the most gangster member of the 3-man team, the fire chief. This absolute madman would wire the driver and gunner his commands from what was effectively an Xbox controller to direct them in. And he would do it from 15 feet away on the outside of the tank.
How are you even alive?
He can't stand behind the tank because that's where the jet intakes are, and he can't be in front of it because that's where the 18,000 pounds of thrust is dumping half a swimming pool on an oil well. He's got to be off to either side. The driver and the water gunner at least have a tank to protect them from the raging heat 25 in front of their faces, and the only thing protecting this guy is the sheer size of his nuts. And with the oil fires raging in Kuwait, it was now time to test this man-machine team to see what Big Wind was really capable of doing. After deploying to the Persian sands, Big Wind would stroll up and start knocking down fires. But, mostly due to how late the vehicle was brought in, of the 500 well fires, it would only end up putting out 9 of them over the course of 40 days of action. This was still more than any other team using only high explosives to blast the holes shut, but within a month and a half of its arrival in September 1991, the last well would be capped on the 6th of November after only 6 months of firefighting and repair efforts, which really speaks to both the insanity and the capability of the firefighting crews involved, because multiple groups had tried to calculate how long this would take to plan expenses and whatnot, and all of their estimates had placed the recovery time at 5 to 10 years. But this was the largest non-military mobilization in human history, and including the prep and planning work, everything took only 9 to 10 months. After the majority of firefighting crews got the hang of it with their first few fires, they were able to pick up the pace and put out an average of 3 to 4 fires a day, which unfortunately for the story of Big Wind is a lot more than it was able to accomplish. It probably would have had more credit if it had arrived earlier, but due to the fact that it was only putting out 1 fire every 3 to 4 days instead of 3 to 4 fires every day, I'm not really sure it would have had more real estate in the history books in the long run anyways. In the end, 90% of the 500 oil well fires would be put out by seawater alone. But regardless of how much space it would take up in the history books, this tank is always going to have a place in the halls of internet memes. The rule of cool applies. Because let's be honest here, if you got offered to go firefighting for a day and your options were A, put out an oil well fire with water hoses, or B, decapitate the closest real thing to a fucking fire elemental with a tank sporting a pair of jet turbo laser cannons, I'm choosing the sci-fi brought to life every day of the week, even if it probably does cost more to move around than a couple of guys with flimsy water sticks. And speaking of cost, the financial losses from this entire event were staggering. The firefighting efforts were paid for by Kuwait at a cost of $1.5 billion with a B, and the loss in economic output would drop Kuwait another $10 billion in the hole. At least Iraq finally finished paying their war reparations in 2022, $14.7 billion of which went to the Kuwaiti oil company owning those fields. That said, the environmental damage was mostly reversible, but surprisingly, it seems like it took a while to garner enough support to finally process the local cleanup. Even to this day, there is still a decent amount of the country's land area that is still damaged by the fountains of oil that soaked into the ground during the whole event. At least Big Wind would have a better fate. It was mothballed in 2013, but later the Hungarian MOL Group oil company would revive the vehicle, with the exception of moving the turret to a Czechoslovakian VT-55 chassis. The VT-55 is an armored recovery vehicle based on the T-55 tank, and its improved 2,440 cubic inch or 40-liter diesel engine probably pushes it a little faster than the original top speed of 3 miles an hour. However, until such a time as the Big Wind is needed once again, it will sit in waiting, looking forward to when it gets to spool up and blow out another candle one more time. Thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description, and if you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.